There's a George Carlin quote about it doesn't have to be a conspiracy if there's a convergence of interest. And I love the quote because that's sort of what this is. And people think that when you say, oh, there's a conspiracy to cover up COVID, well, there is. But the conspiracy is this: they're all self-interested in not revealing that they funded research in China that may have led to the deaths of 20 million people. That's ultimately what Fauci.
Rand Paul recently went on the Free the People YouTube channel to point out once again that criminal Fauci funded the research that led to 20 million deaths around the world, right? But hey, Fauci then, did another interview with the New York Times where he said he sleeps fine. He doesn't have a problem with that. He also said about 10 years ago, as Rand Paul points out in this interview, that he thought it was okay if a few million people died, right? As long as research advanced, he didn't care. That's all he needed, right? Millions of people could die, according to Fauci, and as long as it furthered scientific research, he'd be okay with it. Who does that sound like? Not some great people from maybe a century ago, not quite a century, okay? But, and the numbers have just gone up since Rand Paul started pointing this out a few years ago, right? Originally, the mainstream media, the legacy dying media, was on the side of Fauci and continued to defend him, like this article from ABC, right, where they accuse him of saying, that he has these unsupported accusations, that Rand Paul is making unsupported accusations against Fauci. Okay, and Fauci continuously denied the fact that the NIH was funding gain-of-function research and that they led to, and then that research led to the deaths of millions of people. I mean, who would want to admit such an absolutely tremendous and evil mistake? So, moving on, it was only a few months later, right? This article came out in July, and then only a few months later, the NIH admitted that they were funding that risky research in China because they knew what they're doing was illegal and that they shouldn't be doing it in the United States. Fauci has been in the news in numerous occasions over the last few years for other horrible cases as well, like in Africa, funding violent research using puppies, just all the worst things you can possibly think of this guy is involved in. It's pretty terrible. So yeah, Fauci, Fauci and Rand Paul continue to clash over these royalties that people in government were receiving from private entities. That's not supposed to happen. They're not supposed to be getting money from the people that they're supposed to be evaluating, right? But Fauci continuously denied that. And let's remember, Fauci is the richest guy. It's just about the richest guy in government. He's had the biggest paycheck in government for quite some time. He gets paid more than the president, and he's completely corrupt. He's been around for decades. He's got all the right connections, and he takes advantage of those. So Rand Paul, in this article, he says, they clashed during Wednesday meeting, hearing over royalty payments to government scientists from pharmaceutical companies. We've been asking you, and you refused to answer whether anybody on the vaccine committees get royalties from the pharmaceutical companies. I asked you last time, and what was your response? We don't have to tell you, Paul said. When we get in charge, we're going to change the rules, and you'll have to divulge where you get your royalties from, right? That's important. From what companies, and if anybody on the committee has a conflict of interest, we are going to learn about it. I promise you that. So Paul continues on with his effort to slam Fauci, right? Which is a good thing because Fauci has a pretty terrible record and has done some pretty terrible things. So let's watch a little bit of this recent interview now.
So it really is becoming very, very difficult to get the information together, but then also to get through it because there's an obstacle. First, it's the administration saying we won't give it to you. Then once they give it to a committee, the committee says we won't give it to anybody outside the committee, or we'll let you look at it, in camera, reading it in a room. So, but I do think there's a common sort of link. There's a George Carlin quote about it doesn't have to be a conspiracy if there's a convergence of interest. And I love the quote because that's sort of what this is. And people think that when you say, oh, there's a conspiracy to cover up COVID, well, there is, but the conspiracy is this. They're all self-interested in not revealing that they funded research in China that may have led to the deaths of 20 million people. That's ultimately what Fauci fears, but it's all everybody does, because it wasn't just Fauci. He encouraged them, but State Department funded this kind of research. NIH funded this research. The Defense Department, all throughout government, they were funding this research, and we need to figure out which grants were granted, which ones weren't, and who's culpable in this in order to try to fix it so it doesn't happen again. But they're all saying nothing to see here.
Yeah, it's as if a cynic might suggest that they have something to hide.
Yeah, and in a way they do, but it's not even perhaps illegal. It's just sort of the culpability that they made judgment errors. And this is really what ultimately Fauci will be remembered for is, do I think he was an evil person that wanted to kill the world, wanted to kill 20 million people? No, he was a misguided person with he's an elitist, but also someone with really, really poor judgment. And, his quotes from 2012 will haunt him and haunt the world. He basically said gain of function if it led to a pandemic, if there was an accident at a lab and a pandemic began from a lab research, that it would have been worth it, that the knowledge is worth the risk. Well, tell that to the 20 million people around the world that died from COVID. Was the knowledge worth the risk?
Yeah, and I know I mentioned this New York Times article, and I want to read you a couple quotes from it. It's quite revealing, and it strikes me that he's come full circle on that point and many others where he wrote that journal article saying gain of function is an essential part of the scientific process and it's worth the risk. And then by the time you started asking about it under oath in committee, he was absolutely denying it. And let me see if I can find the quote here. It's towards the end of the New York Times article.
You can read in the dark?
Sort of. Now you're saying things that are a little bit troublesome to me, that I need to go to bed tonight worrying that NIH-funded research was responsible for pandemic origins. Well, I sleep fine. I sleep fine, he says it twice. And remember, this work was done. Notice that. This work was done. Isn't he acknowledging something there? In order to be able to help prepare us for the next pandemic. This work was not conceived by me, as I was not, obviously can't read in the dark. This work was not conceived by me as I was having my omelet in the morning. It's a grant that was put before peer review of independent scientists.
In other words, 5 or 6 of my cronies who also agree with me that I appointed, we all got together over omelets and then discussed this and decided this would happen. But, you're right. He is kind of acknowledging. He's kind of saying, well, even if this did, it was noble. We had noble intentions, even if it did become the pandemic. But I think that remark, I sleep fine, is something that belies the truth. And I think the truth probably is that he is concerned how he'll be perceived in history. And even going back to the early days of the pandemic, January 31st of 2020, he's up till 3 a.m. He's not sleeping well. He can't sleep that night. He's sending email after email. And the last email he sends at 3 a.m. is to a guy that's in charge of the Pandemic Pathogen Committee that should have reviewed this research, but didn't because Fauci went around it. This will be the great error in judgment and maybe even malfeasance, that he chose to go around the safety valve, the safety committee that had been forced on him.